has allocated a dollar amount, the governor has agreed to that dollar amount, and then we all sort of take our slice of the pie, so to speak. The pie is certainly bigger, but the more we can maximize our portion, the more we're going to get. And so this is an important time for folks to be making sure they're uh, getting all the aid possible, doing everything from aidable accounts. And I know Mary and Marquez will have a lot to share on that. So thank you both very much for joining us. And I will step back and appreciate you two running with the ball.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having us again. We're looking forward to diving in here. Um, just a reminder, Baird works with school districts in a variety of different ways. On the slide here, we've got our list of services and products we use as we work with school districts. I know I see a lot of familiar faces on the call, so thanks again, John, for this opportunity to present. We've also usually as part of our presentations, we have a slide here that shows our full team, right? We have a banking team as well as a school business solutions team, of which Mary and I are both on. So, hopefully you guys recognize our faces when we're at conferences or out in the real world. As John mentioned, this is the second session or second session in a three-part series. And the focus today is on maximizing your special education aid. This is timely because, as John mentioned, there was a large increase in special education aid available, right? It's some certain. But last year, the special ed reimbursement for your aidable costs, right, came out a little bit above 30%. This year, the DPI was using a 35% figure. They usually start out with a lower number because they want to avoid overpaying districts. And ideally, right, we're going to find out here in the next few months what the final reimbursement rate is going to be, and we are optimistic that it's going to be above 35%. So, as John mentioned, high cost was the first topic that we covered back in February. That claim was due at the beginning of this week, Monday, March 2nd. As I was talking to Mary before this call began, I think in an ideal world, we would have actually had this topic first, but deadlines can cause priorities to change, and we wanted to make sure everybody knew about the high costs and was able to submit a claim if they wanted. So thanks again for joining us. Moving on, we have our learning objectives. We also try to make that a part of each one of our presentations. Just to give you a sneak peek of what we're going to be covering here. I'm going to focus on the first one, the first learning objective of just reviewing some basics of special ed aid eligibility and some account coding. And then Mary's going to come in for the second and third learning objectives where we, try to identify some of those revenue opportunities and then understanding ways to find additional support and resources. And for those of you who didn't know, I actually started my career as a special education teacher. So I was well versed in the IEP world on the front end, which, I thought I would never use again. And then when I made the transition into the school business world, it helped at least having that base knowledge of, what are some of the special ed lingo and the terminology and all that. But one of the important things as we start to look at what is eligible for special education categorical aid is the term excess cost, right? And so that DPI defines it as a cost that would not exist, but for the need to provide a free and appropriate or FAPE, free and appropriate education to students with disabilities as specified in their IEPs. So it's a mouthful, but I always say the simple way to understand that is right is the cost that you're thinking about coding right into one of a couple different categories. Is it really an excess cost? Meaning, if the student didn't have a disability, would that cost exist, right? And if the answer is yes, the cost would still exist, it's probably not an excess cost. If the answer is no, right, without that disability and the need specified in the IEP, you wouldn't have that cost, then yes, it is likely an excess cost. And another thing we want to point out about special education categorical aid is that it's actually the eligibility requirements are a little more strict than for federal grants, right? So the federal IDEA grant, for instance, you can put in some supplies and purchase services and get reimbursed for that in the grant. But for categorical aid, there's much fewer expenses that are eligible for categorical aid. So some examples, At a high level, I always say really special education categorical aid really only covers a few things, right? I would say salary and benefits of licensed special education staff, right? And when I say special education staff, typically I'm talking about teachers, aides, paraprofessionals. There's also the pupil services, right, where a portion gets prorated based on used to be called Act 220. Now it's pupil services eligibility. So that would include social workers, guidance counselors, nurses, psychologists. And then there's a few other special ed positions, OT, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and some SPED directors. But outside of that, right, there aren't really many other special ed eligible staffing positions. John, I noticed you unmuted. Were you gonna chime in here?
Yeah, don't forget, folks, that speech and language pathologists are considered instructional staff, and that's a big
Y-
one.
Yes, correct. Yeah. So yep, that would be lumped in that first bullet point, instructional staff. So thanks for pointing that out, John. And then the other one outside of these licensed positions, right, is specialized transportation routes, right, or specialized transportation. If all the students on that route have IEPs that require transportation, then it would be an eligible route, eligible for categorical aid. But really, I always say it's really those two big buckets. It's salary and benefits of licensed special ed staff and transportation. Um, and that's important to understand, right, as we move on to the next slides and we start talking about some of the account coding. So, as we were preparing this presentation, I was like, well, we're going to be talking about some projects and some objects and sources. And so I thought it worthwhile, since I know we probably have a range of people viewing this, to just quickly cover the WUFR, right, the Wisconsin Uniform Financial Accounting Requirements. So I got one of the slides I use often to kind of break up. You'll see these account codes if you're looking at financial reports for DPI or likely internally. And each little chunk or segment of this code has a meaning, right? So on that top row, right, we have, there's the fund, right? And when we talk about special education, we're talking about Fund 27. Then there's types, right? There can be either expenses or revenues. Locations are going to vary district to district. Objects and sources. So the object is typically what are you spending on, or the source is where is the source of that revenue. And then there's functions, and then there's projects, right? And the two that we're going to focus on today are going to be object and source, right? So how are you coding that expense or coding the revenue you're receiving? And then the big one, though, is project. And we're going to reiterate this multiple times, but all special education expenses have to have a project code, right? So this varies from, your Fund 10, which most of your accounts in Fund 10 probably don't have a project code, but in special ed, every expense needs to have a three-digit project code. And then on the next slide, we'll kind of dive into what are those examples, right? So I took a screenshot from the special education annual report that goes to DPI each year on the right-hand side, and that screenshot lists an example school district's Fund 27 or Special Education Fund expenditures, right? And you'll notice there are four different projects. There's Project 011, there's Project 019, and those fall both under state and local. And then under the federal subtotal, there's Project 341 and 347. And there are a couple other very small potential projects, but this will cover 99.9% of all of the expenses that you'll see in special ed. And I'll repeat again, right? All special education expenses must have a project code. If you do not have a project code, and then you try to send this data to DPI, right, for reporting purposes, it's going to be a rejected account and not going to be sent, right? Because as I mentioned, right, all special education expenses must have a project code. So we'll review those four basic categories, right? So Project 011 is a local categorical aid eligible cost, right, or an aidable expense. And so these are paid using your local funds, right? But then they get reimbursed through the state categorical aid, right? And that reimbursement is always a year delayed, right? So this year, as school districts are receiving special education categorical aid, it's based off of last year's expenses, right? So a lot of aid kind of works on a year delay basis, right? Because they need to know what did you spend to know how much to give you, right? The other local type of expense is Project 019, and that's a local non-aid eligible expense. And so those ones are expenses that basically don't fall into those two buckets I said at the couple slides ago, right? Either it's not a licensed special education staff member, or it's not transportation, right? So if it's supplies, purchase services, right, that's going to be coded to 019. You're not going to receive aid on it. I did have a second bullet point under that one there, though, because you may receive special education categorical aid on some of those 019 costs through an indirect method known as transitive aid. So if, for instance, you're paying a CISA or another LEA for a service, right? Maybe you don't quite have the need for a full-time occupational therapist. Maybe you're paying another district to have their occupational therapist come over for 4 hours a week, right? You're paying them. So by definition, you would put that in 019, but then the following year, that district or CISA will transit that portion of the aid back to you. So because it's a service, right? It's a 300 on the object, begins with a 3 on your object. It's not a salary or benefit, and it's not transportation. It's Project 019, but that one, in those two examples of paying an LEA or CISA, you do get aid indirectly. And then the last two, right, those federal projects are 341 and 347. So those are from the IDEA grants, 341 being IDEA flow through, and 347 being IDEA preschool, right? So preschool is, I think, for students aged 3 to 5, and the flow through is students aged 3 through 21. So those are the 4 different ways to code your expenses, right? And the topic today, right, was maximizing special education aid. So really, right, as we're focused on this, we're going to be focusing on Project 011, aidable expenses, and then the grants, right? 341 and 347. And I always said it was my goal to have as little 019 or non-aidable expenses as possible, right? With the exception of those payments to LEAs or CISAs, right? So we went over that pretty quickly, right? But you'll get the slides in a follow-up email from John. And so hopefully you can go back and review if you have questions. But now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Mary to kind of start talking about the revenue.
Thank you, Marquez. So when we're thinking about special education revenue, and Marquez was talking earlier about source and object, and then also project code. And you'll notice on here we did reference for revenues, which are then we say what source is our revenue. And for most school districts, you're going to have state aid, special ed state categorical aid. You've already heard it. This is the 3rd time you've heard the term. It's some certain. So there's only a certain amount that's budgeted in the state budget. And historically, that has been prorated. And as Mark has indicated, right now, there is a proration that DPI is putting into place. And if you're curious about what the aid reimbursement has been for the past 10 years, DPI does have a summary of that. So that is what is special ed state categorical aid source 611. And then Marquez talked about IDEA flow through in preschool. Those are federal aids. Federal aids are coded to a source that starts with a 7. So those two are coded to 730. And then they have those project codes, 341 and 347. And you heard Marquez say for special education expenses, you need to have a project code. I would suggest for your revenues, for your flow through in preschool, add those project codes to the revenue account number as well. That's going to make your life a lot easier as you are running reports and you can show this is what I have budgeted for flow through. I can just pull a report to show all my 341 project numbers, revenues and expenses, and you'll be able to quickly see that they're balanced. Same thing for preschool. Districts also may receive some Medicaid, and that could vary depending on the Medicaid eligibility of your students, but that's going to be a common federal revenue. And then there are some other revenue sources like transitive aid that Marquez had just mentioned, and maybe some other ones. And that would be a time to look at the Woofer revenue matrix to see what other eligible revenues you might be able to be receiving in Fund 27. And then we wrap it up with a transfer from Fund 10. So Most districts also have a transfer that they're transferring revenues or transferring money from Fund 10 into Fund 27 because the balance needs to be zero at the end of the year. So if you look at all of your special education expenses, what do they total? And then if I'm looking at my special education revenues that I've received, my state aid, my federal aids, any other transitive aids, and likely that's not going to equal your expenses. And so then in order to have those equal, you're going to transfer funds from Fund 10 into Fund 27. But of course, what we're trying to do is looking at ways that we can increase those other revenue categories so that we're not transferring as much from Fund 10. Because if we can keep that money in Fund 10, we can use that for all students, not specifically students who are identified as students that receive special education services. So we want to be strategic with our funding and with our coding, and just thinking about where you are coding and how you are coding people. So one of the first things as you're thinking about maybe I have an employee who files for Medicaid and does Medicaid school-based services, and so we're filing for some Medicaid claims. You don't want to have that person then coded to Project 341 or 347 because that's a Medicaid with federal revenue, and IDEA flow through preschool are federal revenues, and you can't double dip. So one of the first things that you want to know is who is claiming for Medicaid this year, and then making sure that you're going through your IDEA budgets to make sure that you don't have those people in the IDEA budget, because you can have those people in your coded to 011. You can receive state aid and Medicaid that way, but you can't receive two federal reimbursements. Also, as you're looking at that then, and if you're saying, oh, I have some staff members who are in flow through, and I'm going to pull them out because they're applying for Medicaid, but I don't have anybody else, like all my staff are Medicaid billing. Maybe I don't have as many people to put in flow through. That frees up some additional funds in flow through. Then maybe there would be an opportunity then to look at, as long as you're meeting maintenance of effort, to potentially look at Title I school-wide if you are a school-wide school. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end because it doesn't apply to everybody. But for sure, make sure that you are looking at your coding for where you are budgeting your staff if they're claiming for Medicaid. Then considering if you're doing high cost special education aid, how are you coding there? And then looking at maintenance of effort and make sure that you are meeting maintenance of effort. One of the things that if it looks as though you're not meeting maintenance of effort, make sure that all of your accounts are flowing to Wise Data Finance. So is there a possibility that there was a Fund 27 expense that didn't have a project code there? That could make it artificially look like you're not meeting maintenance of effort when you really are. So make sure that you are watching and paying attention to that maintenance of effort.
And Mary, just a couple of things on
Yeah.
that last slide.
Yes.
We have two relevant workshops in the AEF YouTube channel. One is Medicaid billing, maximizing Medicaid billing. And in fact, it was the AEF treasurer, Janelle Moratz, who gave us that workshop. That was a good one. And then some other folks from Baird did a nice workshop. In fact, Mary, you were, I think, part of the one that we did on Title I school-wide set-aside.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So a couple other resources for folks and very germane with what you got here. Thank you.
Yes.
Mary, can I?
Oh,
I was going to hop in too. So I actually had a district call me the middle of this week or at the beginning of the week saying my superintendent was at the federal funding conference last week. And when they looked at our maintenance of effort, we weren't hitting maintenance of effort. They were kind of freaked out, right? And I said, well, let's take a look. And kind of to Mary's point, we looked and they had some expenses that didn't have project codes, which means that they weren't sending over to the DPI. Once we fixed the accounting, right, move those to the correct account code, then the data was flowing correctly and it showed that they were meeting a maintenance of effort. So, right, just because there's an error that pops up, right, maybe you're not meeting a maintenance of effort, you got to always make sure that you're your accounts are coded correctly, because if they're not, that can cause other issues with reporting.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about account coding, and this is an example of how that you could have a lot of different account coding. So you could use different project codes to get kind of different outcomes. And this is just going to be a really high level example. Let's say that we have a licensed special education teacher whose total salaries and fringe benefits totals $100,000. So you could decide to code that to flow through. Maybe you would, so it would have that project code of 341, right? And you're going to claim 100% of that $100,000. You're going to receive reimbursement for that. It's not going to be part of the state categorical aid calculation, and no local funds are going to be used. That's option number one. Option number two is you could put 100% of those salaries and fringe benefits into 011. So then that's special education categorical aid eligible. And then you could receive approximately, and now I have 35% here, not saying that's what the proration is going to be. It just makes it easier for like numbers. So that's why I didn't get fancy and say, you know, like have a better estimate. But we're just going to go with 35%. Excuse me, I'm sorry. There's going to be, so everything is coded to 011. So we're not going to get any IDEA flow through funds claimed. And then we're going to receive $35,000 because 35% of 100,000 is 35,000. Then that remaining 65,000 will be paid with local funds. Or we could do a combination, and we could divide this staff member's salary and benefits up and have $60,000 coded to Project 341 in IDEA, right? And then the other 40,000 into 011. Okay, so then for 35% of 40,000 would give us an additional $14,000 of aid. So now this position, we've received 60% from the federal government and 14% reimbursement from the state government. Our remaining local funds would be the balance of 26,000. So this would be a way of looking at how can I code this person depending on how I'm going to use them for Medicaid, how am I using them for high cost special education and the like, and make sure that I have those coded as I'm setting up payroll so it can make it easy for doing your grant claims. And at the end of the year, that when you're doing your special ed annual report, you have that person appropriately coded. You're going to want to work through that and make sure that you have that in your budget. But that could be a way that you might be able to be strategic with your account coding. So we talked about IDEA grants, and basically what I want to do just on this summary, again, is to remind you that you have project codes. These are federal funds, and when you have IDEA grants, these formula grants are only for students with IEPs. You can't use that for other students. There is a maintenance of effort component that you have to make sure that you are meeting annually. And you are allowed to carry over funds for a certain amount of time. And DPI will help you with that and help track that to make sure that you're using the funds in an appropriate amount of time. Then we also have Title I funds. Now, Title I funds are different. They are used in Fund 10, and they're also federal funding, so they have Source 730. And again, you're going to want to use that project code. This project code is 141. So again, even if it's in Fund 10, it's a federal fund. You know you can match it. Use that project code so you can track those revenues and expenses. Now, Title I is targeted assistance unless you have a school-wide school. So if you have a school-wide school, then you can use those title funds in that school, not just for some specific students. There is a supplement, not supplant component that you need to make sure to pay attention to. You're also going to have to, if you have multiple buildings, look at comparability. And there are carryover limitations as well for Title I. So those are some things that you want to keep in mind as you're thinking about Title I. So for some districts, if you have a Title I school-wide school and you're looking at your IDEA grant budget and you're meeting your needs for your special education students. You have maybe you have some large carryover or so for your flow through, and you have an opportunity potentially to set aside a portion of your IDEA allocation for your Title I school-wide programming needs. And this could be an opportunity that you're going to review. Maybe it's just a one time, like you have a large carryover, and this is an opportunity to take funds that are normally used for special education and that you can put them into use in that Title I school-wide school for a year. Or maybe it's an ongoing thing, but this is something that you want to review on an annual basis. We're not going to go into it today, but there is a whole component that you are going to want to look at to calculate that Title I school-wide set-aside. And then again, it's going to be really important to be paying attention to the project code. So we've talked a lot about project code 341. And we're usually thinking that that's in Fund 27. If you're doing Title I school-wide set-aside, you're going to be coding expenses in Fund 10, but with a 341 project code. And again, so now if you're doing both of those and you're pulling a report, make sure you're looking at Fund 10 and Fund 27 to make sure that you're spending or that you're budgeting appropriately for all of your IDEA flow-through funds. One of the things before I move off this slide, and this applies not just for Title I, but if you're looking at any of your grants, make sure that your ledger matches your WISE grants budget. So make sure that what WISE grants shows is what you have in your financial software as well, so that those are tying out. That's why using those project codes can make it really easy to quickly run a report to make sure that they match. That's going to make your life a lot easier when it comes time for annual reports. Obviously, it's going to have an impact on your maintenance of effort. If you have things coded potentially to flow through that should have been in another category, those could have some impacts on you. And then also, if you are doing Title I school-wide set-aside, you're still going to have to complete time and effort reports. But there is a supplement, not supplant. If you're meeting maintenance of effort, you don't need to worry about that supplement, not supplant violation there. And then we're going to wrap up with some additional resources. DPI has a lot of different resources there. We talked about the Woofer matrix. There's also a page where you can find the special education aides in their proration. And Rick Cruz is a contact at DPI. Reach out to him if you have questions about different coding opportunities potentially. They're happy to take questions. And as are Marquez and I, if you have any questions about how could I code or what if, those sorts of things, we're happy to take some time and connect.
Yeah, would you, Mary or Marquez, give just a quick example here? I think aside from the Title I set-aside thing, the basic idea here, and I was jotting some notes, we want to maximize our aidable expenses, things that are paid from 019, 341, or 347 non-aidable sources. We can move any of those things into that 011 aidable source and capture. You gave that little scenario there, Mary, about 3 different ways to sort of code a staff member. And, you know, a senior special education staff member in my district might be making $65,000 with $35,000 in benefits. If we code it to 011, the aidable, we get about $35,000 back from the state. That's the best case scenario. And I think we could maybe just expand upon that or re-clarify that again, that the whole idea here is to pay for aidable things from aidable accounts.
Mm-hmm. Right. So if you have supplies that you're for special education, budget those. Those are not aidable. So put those in flow through first. And then before you put a staff member or some aidable expense into flow through.
Yeah. And then clarify again the Medicaid piece of that. If I have a staff member who does a lot of Medicaid billing, I don't want to have them paid from flow through.
Correct. Because flow through is federal funds and Medicaid is federal funds. So basically think about it as like um, you can't bill the federal government and receive funds for those services and then put that into flow through. So
Yeah,
take that person
they're already
out.
paying us for some of that time.
Yes,
So why not maximize the revenues I
exactly.
can?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Go ahead, Mary. I'll let you finish.
I was going to say, so in those cases, what you want to do is, so maybe you can take that person out who's doing the Medicaid claiming, and if you need to put another person into flow through, and that could be something that's happening on a quarterly basis that you're looking to see, did anything change with who is claiming, and making those adjustments because you don't want to have to back out the flow through portion when you're doing your PCG claiming.
Yes. Yep. So when you are doing the Medicaid claiming, right, it's a quarterly process. You have to specify, is that person's salary federal or, local, right? And back to John's point and Mary's point, right? You don't want if one of those employees is going to be providing Medicaid eligible services, right? You don't want them to be funded out of the grant. And so I do want to, I always like telling stories, right? Because I think those are memorable. And so I had a district last year that we were working on at the end of the year, kind of looking at their expenses and starting to work on their annual report and their special ed annual report. And I looked and I said, wow, you have a lot of Project 019 expenses. And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, when I look at that summary page on your special ed annual report, you have more 019 than you have 011. And they said, that's interesting. And so then I pointed that out and they're like, oh, I've just never changed it. That's just the way it's always been. And I was
Oh,
like, well, are they licensed staff? And we kind of looked at all the staff and looked it up on ELO, the licensing website for DPI. And sure enough, virtually all of their 019 expenses, just simply we had to switch the account code to 011 and they received like 300,000 more dollars in aid, right? Just from the coding, right? And I would hope that that's like a pretty rare example, right? But the fact that it happened with one district I worked with last year means that there are likely other opportunities out there where you want to make sure, does it really need to be coded to 019 or can I put it in 011? Are they a licensed staff member? Is this specialized transportation? Or if not, let's move that into the grant so we can maximize that revenue.
sure. Yeah, that's a great story. What a win, huh? How?
Yes,
Wow.
I know. And they were very thankful. I'm like, hey, I didn't do anything. I just helped you change one digit at the end of your project, right? Um, and going back also to that Medicaid, right? I think that's another example of where, similar to the high cost claim, oftentimes the work can be siloed, right, between the business office and the special ed director or whoever's managing the IEP caseloads, right? But there does need to be some communication, especially with high cost claiming, right? Not one person has all the information. You got to kind of work together to get it all. But for Medicaid billing, as the business office is the one who coded everybody for payroll, right? Every year I would begin by going to my special ed director and saying, hey, we had so and so coded to the grant last year because they weren't doing any Medicaid eligible they weren't providing any Medicaid eligible services. Is that still true? Because I want to make sure we are not putting anybody in there that is providing Medicaid eligible services. So it was something you have to review every year, right? Because things change, right? Maybe that person's now in a different role or working with different students that are now Medicaid eligible. So it's just a reminder of like always, there does need to be a lot of communication and don't be afraid to double check so that you make sure you're getting the most out of the revenue available.
What's helpful stuff. And anybody who wants to unmute or chime in with a question, we're happy to take those. Anybody got any follow-up? If not, I will be sending the slides out and posting the recording on our YouTube channel. And then along with that, Marquez and Mary have their email addresses and contact information. I know when I was both at now from the special education side of things, but also when I was a superintendent, I just had so much positive experience working with the folks from Baird and all of your financial expertise. We had a number of things that we went through to increase categorical aid over time, Marquez, and not all in one big fell swoop like that, but over the course of a few years, we really increased our categorical aid reimbursement, and it's big money. Well, very
Thanks,
good.
John.
Yeah, thank you both. Really appreciate your time this afternoon and expertise. And we will look forward to our next session. Just tips and tricks, just kind of interesting things and some of those stories, Marquez, that might come out like, hey, did you think about this? Did you think about that? There's some neat ways to capture some funding that people may not be thinking of or recognizing. And it's always fun to hear the latest and greatest opportunities out there. So thanks again. We will see you again, and happy trails.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.